Welcome back. I hope 2021 was good for you so far. I've seen that you've been pretty active recently, and maybe you utilize the fact that we're still in all kinds of lockdowns and quarantines to work more on your research.
Yes, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to speak again after quite a long time. Yes, so I've been, I finally finished my corrections on my dissertation, and I've also been starting to work on various research proposals going forward. But in particular, I managed to finally write up an article that I've been trying to get out for a while, which is just published last week in the journal Nomadic Peoples, which was a slightly odd choice, but it was actually because there was a prize, an article prize available there. So I submitted in order to enter that prize, which I won, which is nice. So, you know, we sometimes need to jump through various hoops to sort of kickstart academic careers. And also it was, this journal is quite closely associated with the anthropologist Dawn Chatty, who I'm a big admirer of and have worked with over the years, and she's given me a lot of advice. Her work is not really mostly on Jordan, it was mainly on Syria, looking at the al-Fad al-Badawin and various other issues to do with French mandate policy. And later she's also done a lot of ethnographic work actually in Oman and on sort of broader historical themes. And she was my external thesis examiner for my PhD as well. So for all sorts of reasons, it made sense to submit to this journal which she's involved with. So this article that I've written is called Ghosts at the Feast, Contested Land, Settlement and Identity in the Jordanian Badia. I think last time we began to touch on some of these points, but what it's really about this article is, you know, I think last time we talked a bit about the sort of long history of the way Bedouin and the Badia as a concept is sort of represented and reproduced and constructed in historical accounts and in sort of state administrative systems as well. Right the way back to sort of from medieval Arabic sources through Ottoman imperial times, through the Mandate and into the present. And this article is trying to consider that from the point of view of a single village, al-Walid, southeast of Amman. You know, you probably know roughly where it is, very near the desert highway. Yeah. So, you know, I think the broader scholarly sort of background.
Maybe it's close. Sorry to interrupt you. Maybe it's close to Al-Fayed's territory.
Yes. So it's actually So it's the sort of the main Ashira in the village, the Hamsha, who are, you know, close associates of the Al-Fayed's sort of political dynasty.
Of course.
But yeah, I suppose the broader sort of scholarly intervention this article is slightly making is around cultural constructivism. You know, I think in post-Saidi Middle East studies, particularly in Jordan, where you have the huge legacy of Joseph Mossab, that everything has become a cultural construct, and rightly so in some ways, and in particular a kind of colonial cultural construct. But I want to show how ideas like being Badu or being of the Badia, I mean, I should say al-Walid is on the edge, you know, it's not across, it's not on the other side of the old Hijaz railway. So technically it's not exactly Badia, but people in Amman would often say al-Walid, or, you know, it's a Badia village. But what I wanted to show is that actually this sort of construction goes back a long way, and it's not a sort of shallow creation of the situation post Black September in relation to the Palestinians, and it's not entirely a colonial construct either. It goes back a long way, and it's to do with quite deep dispositions. I mean, last time, you know, we talked a little bit about sort of medieval Arab historians like Ibn Khaldun and Maqdisi and their thoughts on sort of the way they wrote about tribes and Bedouin, and we also talked a little bit about ideas sort of like coming out of North Africa and Kabylia in Algeria, and the sort of methods of social categorization, I guess you could call it. So with this article really focuses in ethnographically on al-Walid and a particular sort of feasting occasion that I attended and sort of analysed, held by some Dahamsha friends of mine for a returning expatriate worker, attended by various sheikhs and muqtars from the village and surrounding areas, and particularly the way conversation at this feast turned to both what made it a distinctive kind of hospitable event, and a sort of formal setting for hospitality, a particular type of hospitality that I call sort of formal intimacy, because it's both intimate but also formal.
Because you have certain rules of intimacy in not only Bedouin culture but generally in the Middle East. It's not informal chit chat like what we're used to experience in our cultures. Yeah, you have all kinds of rules.
Exactly, and how and because of this, and this sort of rule-based hospitality creates a particular atmosphere and encourages a particular type of political talk to do with land and land relations, and also kind of in many ways serving to emphasize and to reinforce hierarchies of age and gender, and who gets to speak and in what order and who gets listened to is all sort of mirrored in the way people sit and interact. So I'm sort of analyzing these dynamics, but at a broader level, I also wanted to analyze some of the sort of the ways that al-Walid is being created as this kind of place. And one of the things that I go into in the article a little bit is the sort of divergent sort of firstly, the roles of hospitality in sustaining ideas of al-Walid as somewhere where Bani Sakha Bedouin who are now working abroad or living in Amman or Madaba return to the village to partake in this kind of hospitable atmosphere, but also to pay respects to sort of senior lineage members. But I also wanted to focus on the dynamics of family land and everyday politics, sort of through the medium of this kind of Diwan-centric discourse of feasts and what you do in these sort of, asma, these sort of formal invited events, sort of invitationary events, and the way they have a kind of appeal to a kind of idea of a Bedouin past of sort of mobility, autonomy, and fierce independence from the state, where they could deal with the state as sort of through interpersonal techniques of interpersonal association rather than as kind of subject citizens. I guess I also wanted to explore on a more kind of grounded level the way the outside and sort of increasing state encompassment has differently impacted different people there at the feast. So I'm looking at, in particular, the kind of divergence between those who've gone down the classic Bedouin route of military service and or work in government, including the people I knew best there, working in the civil service, in government departments, and some of their relatives who were there who are still working as pastoralists and keeping animals.
I have a question for you, because you studied people in the countryside. What do you think about employees in Amman who work for the government institutions? I mean, we know that many of them are from the West Bank, so it's not black and white division. On the contrary, maybe in Amman and Zarga, when you have a higher population of Palestinian Arabs, they also dominate public sector, because it's one of the myths that I hear. I hear that myth from all kinds of scholars that Palestinians, or let's say Palestinian Arabs, to be more specific, control the private sector and public sector is in the hand of East bankers. I think it's not the case for a long time.
No, of course not. And I mean, just put it into context here. There were several people who, the host of this occasion is married into a West Banker family.
Yes.
there are all sorts of links of affinity and kinship, and even the kind of Wasta connections that people at the feast were talking about and had used in their own careers to get sort of positions. Often involved people of West Bank origin. Sure. No, I when I say sort of the typical Bedouin career path, I don't mean so much to suggest that kind of old picture of an East Bank dominated public sector. But I think it is still true that in those, it's more that in those villages, I think military or government employment has been really until relatively recently the only good solid option for a lot of people, apart from agricultural work.
No,
so it's not to suggest that West Bankers don't also have access to the public sector, but rather that in these places there was a long tradition of state service, I guess.
Of course. I mean, I've been a couple of times. I've been arrested and interrogated by inspectors who were from the West Bank, and they work in the police department, in the criminal police. So I totally disagree with the black and white division.
Yeah,
things are more complex, and sometimes people who do the research operate with outdated data.
Things
maybe that's the problem, because lots of my colleagues, if not all of them, are originally from the West Bank, and we are the state's newspaper. Where is bankers in my team, for instance? None. Maybe me and I don't know who else. So to continue with nomads, I have a question for you. Can you say a few words about nomadic peoples? Do you know more about that publication? And
sure.
Please, for our viewers.
So you mean specifically about the journal?
Not only the Middle East. Do they cover other nomadic people? Because
they do, yes. So they're yes, it's a journal with a global and sort of interdisciplinary focus, which includes, sort of human geographers, historians, anthropologists, social scientists, and political scientists as well to some degree. So it's a journal. It's actually it's the journal of the Commission for Nomadic Peoples, which is part of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. And it's published on behalf of them by White Horse Press, which is a very small academic publisher. And it's chaired by Ariel Ahern, who's a geographer in the University of Oxford, but as a kind of international editorial board. So it's a small and relatively niche academic journal, which actually has traditionally had quite a large focus on sort of inner Asian and Central Asian nomadism, but there's always been a sizable Middle East component. And some of the kind of great classic anthropologists of Jordanian Bedouin have written there over the years, like I don't know, you probably know of the Lancasters, William and
of course,
Lancaster.
Of course. I'm familiar with him.
So has a long history, and I think it's generally, if there's a sort of linking factor, it might be said to be a kind of an interest in political ecology, and sort of the way nomads have adapted to kind of conditions of contemporary life and contemporary capitalism and state institutions, which I think is quite useful. I mean, the interesting point for me, and I think for people who work on similar topics for me, is the way that contemporary concepts like sort of being Bedou or Arab are reproduced and maintain and have a kind of socio-political cachet, we could say, which is survived the sort of economic marginalization of nomadic pastoralism as an actual technique, right? I think even by the 1970s, pastoralism was no longer really economically viable in most of the sort of villages where I've been working in Jordan. I think, but that was relatively recent, as long ago as 1952, when Jordan's first housing survey took place. Al-Walid had no permanent structures at all. It was it had I think it was 25 tents were registered there. But there were no permanent structures according to the housing survey. There were some agricultural buildings, but they were just used for storage. It was already becoming a center, but it's a relatively recent transition, as we talked a bit the first.
How many people live now in that place, that village? What's the population of that village now?
Well, this is exactly the sort of thing I'm talking about in this article, you see, because this is the thing. People live there, and they also keep returning there, even though economically it's incredibly inconvenient. A lot of these people commute by bus every day to Amman to work in government offices. They have to get an hour bus, a sort of 40-minute bus to Madaba, and then they have to wait around for the state bus to come and pick them up to take them into the capital. So it can be a 2-hour commute or more, both ways every day. But people do live there, and when young people who are fed up with this or are struggling to find work want to move out, they face a great deal of social pressure, as I'm sure you know, not to move out and to stay in the villages. And there's an idea that the villages, these villages are the proper place, and are associated with a kind of ideas of autonomy and of a kind of sovereignty, really. And I talk about how people say that in Al-Walid, we can keep the police wouldn't just come into the village if there was a problem. We'd be invited to see the governor or a minister and take coffee with him and discuss what the problem was. And one example I'm particularly interested in actually is Al-Walid, like a lot of the Bedouin villages in this area, were originally, it was a khaba, it was a ruined tell site. In the case of Al-Walid, it was a large. Walid refers to the Umayyad dynasty,
of course, and the Khalid Walid, of course.
And there was a large Umayyad era sort of
structure, maybe, yes.
You'd call it a palace.
Yeah, you had palaces there from Umayyad time, from Umayyad
the so-called Desert Qusur, I think.
Of course.
There's a lot of archaeological debate around what the Desert
Qusur
were really
and
about.
They're older than
I find very interesting
time. Yes.
And they're right on the edge between the desert and the zone, right? So they've always had this role of mediating relations between empires and nomads, which they in some ways still very much have. And this history is very ancient and also very recent, because as recently as the 1930s, John Bagot Glubb was using these villages in a similar way as sites to settle military veterans from the Arab Legion, and settlement was linked to being able to draw your Arab Legion pension. So they Glubb Bashir is still very much remembered in Al-Walid, and he had a big role there.
He's been very popular in the memory of local Bedouins. It seems that he also understood Bedouins very well.
He's very popular, yeah. There's this joke that he would, to see if a recruit was properly Bedouin, he'd show them an onion and ask them what it was. And if they said Basel, he wouldn't think they were Bedouin. If they said Upsal, he'd know they were Bedouin and admit them to the Legion.
I have another question. Have you read his book, The Path of Empires?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good analysis of different empires, including the British Empire. He drew different characteristics of Arab Muslim empires and states with the British Empire.
I think
few knowledges there.
I think he's been. I think a lot of what he wrote was obviously he wasn't. He very much thought of himself as a military man who was making a foray into history. But I think a lot of his analysis is interesting and kind of has a kind of practical vitality to it and a kind of obvious commonsensical truth. but it's often, the analysis to me seems at times a bit blunt, I'd say.
Yeah,
and I
of
think
course.
there's often more to
I mean, he
things than.
wasn't an academic historian.
No, but he was a hugely
trying to
interesting
sound.
and controversial figure. And I think
True.
I find him very interesting. And yeah, there's certainly his reputation in the Bedouin villages is a really interesting topic, and not at all. Not at all the sort of classic sort of Arab nationalist hatred for the a sort of British colonial figure, which I guess a lot of Palestinian Jordanians would regard him as, and would regard him with deep distrust and disdain, and then later his role in 1956 and his final dismissal by Hussein is obviously another matter. But definitely the memory of the kind of his role in the Arab Legion and the Desert Patrol in the 1930s, and the sort of settlement of the Bedouin villages is, I think, an interesting one, and generally quite a kind of valorized one. But the point, just to get back to the point I was making, the one interesting example of kind of like this sort of idea of al-Walid as a sort of semi-sovereign space, within the state, but sort of having its own form of sovereignty, was a visit which was discussed at the feast by the Ministry of Antiquities, who were concerned about looting in the Umayyad ruins. And unfortunately, as you probably know, like a lot of these places, there has been a lot of looting. I think, bored young men who often unemployed treasure hunt. And, there's an idea that all the graves they open are from the Jahiliyyah. I think, obviously, actually, from the orientation of the graves in relation to the Umayyad era mosque, some of them at least must have been early Muslim graves. But anyway, that's another matter. But certainly looting has gone on, and I think the Ministry of Antiquities was slightly concerned about this, obviously, and had sent someone to assess the site. But in al-Walid, the main fear was that it was both a fear and a potential opportunity that tourism might come to the site. Nearby Omar Assas is a huge tourist site, and busloads of tourists come every day, in the tourist season to visit, or did before pandemic. In al-Walid, there's not really any tourism, and in fact, it's
a
not somewhere you
backwater.
visit.
It's a kind of a backwater of Jordan, that area.
It is, and it's quite an impressive site, so that's unusual. And although some people in the village were interested in the idea of tourism and the income it might bring, there was also a deep distrust and a deep concern that this would, firstly, people discussed how in Wadi Rum and Petra, the wealth generated by tourism hasn't really gone to the host communities. It's gone to outsiders or to people from other sort of settled tribes nearby who've been better able to capitalize on it. There's also this kind of fear of the kind of Bedouin business model of kind of, not to get too much into it, but the kind of fears over authenticity and immorality that have dogged certain tribal groups in the south, very closely involved with tourism, should we say. But there was also a concern, most of all, that it would open up a lot of discussions about land and land ownership. And particularly about state land and the sort of the unfinished business of wajihat, this idea of the state land that was sort of held in trust for tribes, and who owned the land around, some of the land around al-Walid, which was used for grazing and was deeply contested, and many people wanted to build on. So there was a general fear of kind of tourism and development coming into the village. Luckily, they were able to sort of talk to the Ministry of Antiquities and make sure that the site was classified as not of touristic interest, and they made the argument that it's a site from Islamic history, and foreign tourists are only interested in the Roman and classical past, which I think is probably not necessarily true, but
it's not true.
I hope it's not true.
People.
But anyway, this was the way. Yeah, but anyway, this was the way the argument went. Interestingly, And this was, and some of the older guys, they were quite pleased that they'd been able to do this, and they saw this as a kind of, maybe as a test of the strength of their wasta, and that they'd kind of successfully rerouted
how they can influence state factors and impose their will over the Ministry of Antiquities.
So there's an idea of so just to sum up your question about Amal. So there's a sort of idea coming out of all of this, which I want to build up, about the talk at the feast, and sort of this idea of the way people use the resources of a kind of idea of a nomadic Bedouin past. But it creates this sense of Walid as a protected space, and like the Hamshire as a kind of protected name and a name offering protection. And that's sort of the point I wanted to make through this article. So I start very precise, sort of in a very tight ethnographic focus on this specific encounter, but then I kind of want to use that to explore some really quite big themes around the kind of presence of history in the contemporary, and the way socio-political categories kind of take on a life of their own in these sort of settings. So that's sort of the main thrust of my sort of most recent publication, I guess. Yeah.
What was your general impression about that community? Because you studied them for probably more than a year.
Well, I mean, not. I didn't spend all that time in Walid. I was interested in general in the sort of rural communities around Madaba, and their sort of the sort of political and economic history of these places, and how it relates to their contemporary role. I mean, I suppose my impression was that places like Walid are going through, like many places in the world, a period of profound uncertainty and a kind of dilemma. Obviously, some people have made money out of selling off land and kind of diluting that sense of Walid as a protected social universe. Other people are profoundly anxious about doing this. I think many Bedouin families realize that land or claims to land, whether actual through owning the land or having it registered in their names or through hijah documents, is one of the best sources of income and capital they have, and that once that's sold or alienated, it's gone forever. It's a sort of non-renewable form of wealth.
Of course.
But I think one of the big concerns, is rising unemployment, and for young people, how to stay in the villages, how to socially reproduce when they can't afford to marry, in times of unemployment. We talked last time a bit about this idea of waithood, about young people kind of stuck in a perpetual limbo between, being sort of being teenagers and being sort of responsible adults. The way sort of Shabab is becoming a kind of politically significant category in a way in these places, and you have this sort of proliferation of from the Ministry of Youth. You have Markaz.
I mean,
Shabab,
in Jordan, 70% of the population are individuals between 15 and 35, or let's say 4 years of age.
And I mean, it's obviously in different places that challenge, and that sort of the challenge of demographics, but also the challenge of social reproduction for young people plays out differently. But I think it has a particular set of problems in these places. And I mean, Amal Walid is, you can actually see some of the sort of tall buildings in West Amman from the top of the hill in Amal Walid. It's all, the city is almost within sight. And there's always both concern and also expectation and some sort of hope about future speculation that the city might expand, or that, something like happened with, the El Fayez family made so much money out of the land, which became the airport. And then other people have speculated and started to enclose land further east, to talk of, building the new capital in the east, the new city. New government housing. So there's always this thought that, perhaps enclosing land, little bits of land, and then claiming it might be a worthwhile thing to do. And then other people are, hoping to leave Amal Walid or even leave Jordan to work elsewhere and to gain money. So I think there's a sort of sense of as is often the case, probably of dilemma over how best to sort of socially reproduce, how best to find a good way of living, really, in these places. And while Umm al Walid, a few miles north and west, you have Umm al Ahmed, which is just such a different world. It looks so different when you drive through it. It's this sort of, the road is lined with villas and palaces, which the various Al Fayez family members have built.
Yes.
And then another sort of slightly further, maybe sort of 20 or 30 miles south, you'll come into the south and southwest. You'll come into villages which are far, far poorer and more desolate than Umm al Walid. Eventually, you'll cross Wadi al Hisa and enter into the.
You have all kinds of discrepancies and all kinds of contrasts between different communities.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Across this river, you've got the Bani Hamida, and while the Sukhur are still sort of loyal, to some degree, sort of loyal sort of state supporters. In the Hamida lands, it's the homeland of Iraq and of revolutionary protests.
Sometimes,
which is another set of responses to the land and crisis and to the problem of youth.
Sometimes different communities face repression and face different treatment by authorities. And
yes, exactly.
On the one hand, others are flourishing, while the opposition community is declining and suffering economically for all kinds of angles. They're hit from different angles because of their attitude towards the regime.
And even quite small differences in terms of distance to the capital and to roads and to infrastructure have had huge differences on the price of land, which in turn massively impacts the sort of the chances for formerly pastoral families to sell off land and to make the money to allow their kids to marry and to sort of set up independent lives. So they land, I think, round Umm al Ahmed goes for went for, I should say, this was a few years ago, I think up to sort of 20,000 JDs per dunam,
which is nothing.
But then it'll go down to sort of 3,000 in the sort of south, around sort of areas around sort of outside of Omar Assas, and even cheaper across into the sort of areas around Diban.
Of course.
So you have this sort of enormous, and I won't get into it now. We talked about it a bit last time, but the process of settlement under the mandate meant, and since then, meant that a series of quite canny moves, often by certain sheikhs and influential families, who registered large amounts of tribal land in their own names. So that dictated, so then sort of weaker ones and weaker tribal groups, weaker Ashira, then had to choose slightly further out places. And those sort of kind of strategic things that happened, quite a long time ago, had major implications now in terms of sort of people's access to capital and to land. So
the main problem is not that Jordan is a poor country. I completely disagree with that notion. Jordan is not poor at all, but we face discrepancy in the profit. We have all kinds of social contrasts and social divisions. And on the one hand, we have, I wouldn't say hundreds and thousands of billionaires and millionaires. I wouldn't exaggerate if I say that we have thousands of millionaires and billionaires. But on the other hand, there are lots of people who are dirt poor, and they have no perspective, whether they are a city poor or neglected rural population with no steady jobs, with no perspective at all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I mean, yeah, I think the I mean, every country, I mean, wealth inequality is rising across across the world, really. I think that's a facet of kind of neoliberal late capitalism. But I mean, yeah, I think in Jordan, the side of that that interests me most is kind of ideas of, particularly prevalent, I think, in certain contexts in Bedouin areas, is the idea that there was supposed to be a kind of social contract, that there was an alliance with the royal house, that if the Bedouin settled and stopped raiding, they would be kind of looked after and given part of the proceeds of the state, as it were. And, you know, now that just doesn't really hold true. And this idea of a kind of broken alliance or a broken social contract, almost in terms of sort of in anthropological or historical terms, it's sort of like a moral economy type argument, like Thompson. But the way it's often phrased, which I find interesting, is the idea of a host-guest relationship gone wrong. You know, that the focus is often that the Hashemites were guests who were welcomed in by
the very outdated concept.
The Jordanian tribes, yeah. But I mean, the interesting thing about that isn't its historical accuracy, but it's the way it conceives of a relationship, right? And it casts the relationship as a one between host and guest, where the roles have become reversed or broken. That, you know, the guest has behaved badly, as it were, and has tried to usurp the hosts. And this is the way sort of political and economic protest is kind of one way in which it's articulated, which I think is an interesting and telling one, and connects back to what we were talking about the idea of kind of zones of protection, and the importance of hospitality in kind of marking those zones.
Do you think that such concepts and ideas, notions, that Hashemites were visitors or dynasty that was integrated by local tribes, still have any value and any meaningful support in the presence, or let's say
yes. I mean, I don't have it in front of me, but, you know, I have written transcripts with interviews with figures like Dr. You know, we both know Dr. Ahmed Awadi Al-Abadi and Hind Al-Fayez, who in public speeches have made direct reference to this, and, you know, have you know, when I think in one of Hind's speeches in Karak, she said, you know, when Amir Abdullah came, he didn't come with a sword in his hand, but as our guest. And this sort of rhetoric, I think it certainly it's old hat, and it in terms of sort of post-colonial readings of history. Sure, I think like now we there's a much greater appreciation of how of the sort of complexity of that period in the sort of the various calculations going on between Britain, France, the Sharifian court in Mecca, and the position of the Hashemites in general. So sure, I think like the historical reality can be certainly there's a case for revision there, but at the same time, as a kind of a political claim about the past, I think it still has resonance in circles. I mean, another thing, I mean, you've probably know about this. I understand he's now in rather hot water and is kind of withdrawn, was in prison till recently. But, you know, Dr. Ahmed in his political meetings was showing a map of Jordan from the time of, you know, from Frederick Peake's book on the tribes and history of Jordan. He was showing a map showing the various a sort of Dirah map showing the names of tribes on this map,
tribes of
where
Jordan,
they were. And he was using this in his political meetings to say, look, you see, all this land here was Adwan or Abad.
Of course. Or schemat.
And saying, you know, well, and now look at this modern cadastral survey map from the Department of Land and Survey, and look at all these little names on it, all these property holdings. What happened to our land? 80% of the land, he'd say, was stolen when we invited these people to come among us and sort of settle disputes. So regardless of its accuracy as a sort of an incisive reading of sort of political history, I think it's still an idea which resonates, at least within certain circles. And maybe that's more older and rural circles. I don't know. I need to do some more research. I think Julian Schwedler has more to say on this than I do. And I think so too, the historian, I think you know Tarek Tal quite well, right? He's the social historian. I think, you know,
I know Tal family very well. Normally they're involved with tourism, and they gave a prominent member of the Roman Catholic Church in Jordan. One of the bishops is from Tal family. But
Tarek's work, is very is I think one of the most interesting and thorough accounts of some of this sort of state-making practice and the ways it's being contested by rural, sort of, in inverted commas, East Banker communities. I think,
But how many of them are originally Bedouin? What's the percentage of Bedouin population in Jordan? I don't think they're more than 10%.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you know, Joseph Massad makes the point, which I think is a very interesting one, that you know, he says that by the 1980s, men were calling themselves Bedouin whose grandfathers would have taken it as an insult in this sort of process of Bedouinization. Which is quite interesting. I mean, it's obviously these terms are relational and flexible, and you see that more and more the further you go into the archives and into history. I mean, I think there seems to have been a kind of separation between, at times anyway, sources seem to treat the idea of certain people as Arab or Urban as separate from being Badu, and so you have a sha'ir like Adwan and Abad, and the Jarma treated as, and sort of all the Balgawiya tribes treated as Arab, as sort of, which has some ideas which suggest at least some seasonal mobility in terms of
yes, of course.
But also suggests potentially seems to have often historically meant people who were mostly sheep and goat herders. And then Badu seems primarily have been to have applied to the kind of particularly camel herding Arab Asha'ir, and often ones claiming noble ancestry, you know, Asil ancestry, and also claiming a kind of historical migration out of Najd, which I think, you know, there's evidence that the Bani Sakhab and, you know, other people, the great Anaza Confederacy and the Rawla as well, all came out of Najd in the sort of 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, during a time when Ottoman Bilad al-Sham was sort of militarily weaker, and they were able to move into the Syrian steppe and displace.
And still, it's not a distant history. We're talking about 200, 300 years. And on the other hand, we have records of people.
That's it.
Go ahead.
These terms aren't you know, these terms are always relational, and they're always historically contingent. They have a long continuities and long afterlives in terms of their political resonance as categories. But you know, I think we you know, back if we went back to the 16th century, the Abad in Balga would have seen the Adwan probably as Bedouin, but then by the time the Sukhur come onto the scene and the Rawla, the Adwan are no longer quite Bedouin. They're Arab probably, but you know, it depends on the individual sources.
Of course.
And then by the time of the Arab, many of the First World War, many of the Sukhur were also settled. And would you still call them Bedouin? it's a matter of, it's probably contextual, you know. So in some cases there'd be Arab, and
many of
so
them
all of these terms
settled
are
200, 300 years ago.
So and then the British obviously tried to give an exact answer to your question. You know, when Peake and Glubb sort of came up with the Bedouin Control Law in 1929, they listed 13 tribes. I think they would have called them qaba'il, but you know, not to get too harp on the terminology, 13 tribes who they considered Bedouin, and they were people who spent a sizable portion of the year moving into the sort of the deep Badia, sort of across the Hijaz Railway. And they were considered also the people that were politically sensitive, capable of militarily resisting the mandate, and often people who had specialized economically, or used to specialize economically in camels. And they were also people, of course, who they were worried could move across the border and leave the mandate. And you know, there was always this fear that Audu Abu Tai would defect to the Saudis, to Nejd, and take his military force with him, particularly when, you know, they were all these people at that time were being terribly battered by raids from the Ikhwan, and then the mandate kind of stopped them responding and retaliating in turn to get their stuff, you know, to get their flocks back after they'd been looted. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction, and the British kept having to change this classificatory mechanism. So in 1933 and again in 1939, the Bedouin Control Laws are updated, and who counts as Bedouin and who isn't Bedouin is changed, and it keeps being changed for politically sensitive purposes, really right the way up to 1976, when the Bedouin Control Laws are ended finally by King Hussein. But even now, you know, it lingers on in who gets to vote for the Badia parliamentary districts, you know, that certain family names, rather than voting because they're part of a geographical constituency, instead vote based on their last name. So for the central Badia seat, you know, you have to be a Bani Sakha, really. A series of names, family names are listed, and if you one of those is your family name, then you vote for the central Badia seat. And if you want to stand for another seat, you can't. You know, as Sind El Fayez got very angry about.
I mean, if I have to vote, I'm not voting in Oman. I have to go to Horsafi to vote over there, because I'm registered in that area. Although I never spent 5 minutes in Horsafi. So these are kinds of absurd situations that we're facing because of lack of civic society, and maybe we'll need to wait for another 300 years or 250 years to have a normal, secure, and civic society where people would mingle and vote, not for the closest cousins, but for political programs. And this is the problem here. I don't know how aware you are, but in Jordan, there are no political parties in classical sense.
Yeah.
Even the Communist Party is a group that revolves around a tribal affiliations. Lots of communists that I knew are from Hamarne family, from Madaba, and they operate amongst their kin.
Yeah.
I call them a tribal communist. They're not the normal communists and normal socialists.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point, though, isn't it? Because, you know, in many ways, the kind of egalitarianism and the kind of state refusal of some of these ideas chimes quite well with certain egalitarian and left-wing ideas. And of course, actually, you know, particularly the Bani Hamida famously, but even some of the Suhoor are very left-leaning, and there's a lot of interest in Ba'athist politics. You know, one of my interlocutors' father was a member of the Madaba branch of the Ba'ath Party. And I think, you know, there's as I'm sure there's a lot of hero worship of, or sort of hero, sort of iconography anyway of Saddam Hussein
Of course.
in the Sukhor areas.
Saddam Hussein is also very popular in Karak, because lots of people from Karak studied in Iraq, and they were Baptists. Yes. Although there are Muslim brothers in these communities, because the appeal of
it's not entirely, and again, that's often portrayed as an entirely West Banker political movement, the politicalism, but exactly it's not. It's much more complicated.
It's much more complicated, and Muslim brothers have a political agenda that goes beyond division between West Bank, East Bank, rural, urban, or anything else. They have political agenda that can recruit people from the UK who are 15th generation white Anglo-Saxons and Christians, but for some reason they flip out and they find the motive for their function, and they find the message that moves them in Islam, in political Islam.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very common, and I mean that whole idea of kind of evangelical Islam in Britain and in America is definitely growing. What?
Of course.
I know.
Maybe you've seen this guy who spoke on Islamist channels, Sheikh Yusuf, the American preacher. Yeah. He's a very good speaker, and his rhetoric is Western evangelical rhetoric. The way he approaches listeners is typical for Protestant preachers. But of course, he's a convert. He speaks very good Arabic, I would say perfect Arabic.
They always do, yeah. Sort of,
and his
I did a language course at
very powerful. He has a good approach to Western listeners, and he himself, came from the Protestant preacher family, Sheikh Yusuf. I think he's from Texas.
Yeah, but they so often. I mean, it's not at all my area, but the people I know who are working on the anthropology of political Islam, and I think the anthropology of piety more generally. But I mean, there is, I think, quite a lot of a lot of the analysis sort of draws these comparisons, and sort of particularly that sort of Salafism is in many ways deeply related to ideas of Protestant evangelism, and has these connections. I think I did a language course at Qasid. I was given them a scholarship from CBRL, and that's just who they use for historical reasons. That is an extraordinary institute that has this long history. It comes out of the kind of American Sufi, and then it's full of Euro-American recent converts to Islam who've come to learn the Quran, and sort of wearing their clothes in a sort of according to hadith, and
of course
growing their beard, and being generally quite critical of their neighbors in Amman who are less pious than they are, according to the way they understand it.
It's typical for converts. Many converts are
the zeal of the convert,
and more zealous than people who are.
Well, it's new and exciting for them.
Ideas,
it's not embodied in the same way.
I met a couple of them, and you see women completely covered who speak with a proper Midwestern American accent, or people who are from the UK, and they're also dressed up in a super traditional Islamic garb. So it happens everywhere. We have all kinds of cases in our world. So for the end, what would you say about your future plans? Are you planning to expand this topic, or you have
Mm.
some other sites or some other areas of Jordan that you want to explore more?
So I have several projects going on at the same time. Sort of bits of research I'm trying to keep my hand in during the pandemic, and also hopefully will lead to hopefully one or the other will result in postdoc funding before too long. I'm sort of in discussions. So one area I'm very interested in is we've discussed this before a little, I think,
Yes.
that work on water scarcity, discourses of water scarcity, and how they connect with the situation in Tiban and the Bedouin villages again, but also how they are being played out in sort of suburban and peri-urban communities in East Amma in different ways, and the way they sort of also touch upon the idea of the refugee crisis.
Yes. Because
which I find very
some of them have been refugees for almost 80 years, and they still don't have a nationality, or they don't have a proper status within the country.
And then the other area I'm sort of interested in, I think we've also talked about, is the sort of the long-term historical research interest in the sort of history of social categories in the region. Okay. But another part of that is actually, which I've got sucked into and I'm enjoying more than I expected, is to untangle the disciplinary history in anthropology, because anthropologists have been interested in these sort of questions for a long time, and particularly there's the sort of the long-term influence of segmentary theory, as it's called, and the idea of segmentation, which a lot of anthropologists think comes out of a British anthropologist called Evans Pritchard and his work on the Noor people in the Sudan, but in fact has all sorts of references back to sort of ideas of Arab tribes, and particularly Robertson Smith, who was a 19th century Arabist, and seems to have had a much greater influence on Evans Pritchard's thinking than was previously than was recognized widely anyway within the discipline. And segmentary theory has really been completely panned. It was something I think figures, particularly Edward Said in Orientalism takes a fairly decisive shot at it. And then scholars like Layla Abu-Lugad have worked to critique it quite successfully. And I kind of largely agree with these critiques. And it was kind of a misguided enterprise. And it was based on a series of tropes and stereotypes about certain types of society, including Bedouin societies. The sort of, my brother and I against my cousins, my brothers and my cousins against the world, and this sort of hoary old chestnuts from out the ethnological cupboard. And I mean, yeah, and it doesn't have much of a place in the modern world. But in Robertson Smith, you have these interesting connections back to classical and medieval Arab writers. And you have this whole kind of heritage of talking about relationships of protection and encompassment, largely in political terms, interestingly, rather than in kinship terms, rather than rendering it all about blood and being related. A lot of it's about politics and accepting hierarchy and accepting people's protection and sort of, in a way, again, accepting the protection of the host. So I'm working on an article looking at these kind of severed Arabian roots to segmentary theory, the kind of Arabian school of segmentary theory, if you will. And I'm hoping through that to kind of, I don't wish to undo the kind of post-Saidian, post-colonial kind of critique of that, because I think it still stands. But I want to show that we should be careful that we don't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that there may be some interesting kind of, historical remnants of this kind of outdated anthropological thinking, which we might find useful in gaining a better historical picture of how we look at sort of topics like the ones we've been talking about tonight.
I have a question this is the last question and the last, let's say, comments, the last remark. What do you think about the notion that Arab states are associations of different tribes rather than being states with strong institutions?
I'd say, like all notions of that sort, it's partly true and partly not true. And you could probably say the same about almost any nation in the world. I think, like all such statements, it's as much a kind of political claim and a kind of a particular position or narrative of the past than it is a kind of a model of history, right? And I mean, in particular, generally, when such claims are made about the Middle East, either they're kind of this essentialist sort of the Middle East has always been this way and cannot be changed, or they're saying this is all a kind of colonial construct dating back to Anglo-French divide rule or Ottoman sort of sectarian strife, or whatever they want to place the emphasis. I think I'm always a bit skeptical of these kind of like this huge thing is always this way kind of arguments. They're not really where I'm at sort of in terms of scholarly confidence to explain. But I mean, I think there are interesting things to be said. I mean, another thing going back to kind of Robertson Smith and the older ideas of the Arab tribe in historical thinking is, the point that the Qabila as a category in some ways seems to come out of the experience of conquest, the Arab conquest, sort of under the Rashidun caliphs and the Umayyad Khalifa, and the idea that the Qabila, in a sense, the Qaba'il are sort of regiments of the military regiments, which are become perpetrated into kind of conquest through the kind of garrison towns like Kufa and Basra and Cairun and kind of take on a life of their own and recreate these kind of tribal structures. And I mean, who knows? And of course they weren't like always with these things. They weren't creating on a blank slate. Everyone is made, like Marx says, men make history, but they do not make it at will. And constantly you come up with kind of past idioms and discourses which influence how you think about what comes next. And who knows? It's very hard to unpick the kind of structure and socio-political contents of tribalism in pre-Islamic Arabia. I know some people do work on this, but I think there's definitely a connection to the conquests, and probably even you have people like Sadihan and Barakat who've worked on would suggest that the formation of Arab identity is also bound up with the conquests, and the sort of formalization of the Arabic language even. So I mean, I think sorry, I've got slightly off topic, but to return to your point, I think
you're always answering on my question. And
always these ideas of associations and the Arab nation as a nation in parts and a nation of tribes. There's always some truth and some not truth about these kind of claims, and I guess my point is that they're always historically contingent and historically emergent, and these kind of claims bear the marks of literally millennia of histories of empires and the relationships between different imperial schemes and history on an enormous kind of trans-regional global scale. I think the idea of tribe can often make us think of something kind of parochial and bounded and limited. And these are places that have always been on the edge of empires and the edge of enormous historical
because
events.
when I said tribes, I also thought about urban population. I'm talking about the whole group of people who live in that area and function, whether in urban centers or in the countryside, like Bedouins or farmers. So they have a structure which is very tribal. And they have unofficial system which ignores all kinds of state institutions, whether in the city or in the country. So that was my remark, and it has nothing to do with the ethnic background of people who reside in the area.
Yeah, I mean, and definitely that's a good ethnographic point about that.
That's my definition, by the way. I didn't pull this out from anyone. It's my own definition.
Yeah.
After spending I think 25 years in this region.
But I think that's it, right? Because patron-client relationships and kind of getting things done through Wasta, could work as well to talk about the Sicilian clans, but also like the way neighborhood associations used to work in a lot of Italian communes in Siena and Tuscany as well, even. But these relationships of patron-client can survive a huge amount of historical upheaval, right? And because it is, for all the way people complain about corruption and their concerns, it is often quite an effective way of getting things done in certain ways, or at least giving the impression of getting things done, because you feel like you can go and talk to someone and that you can do things.
It's a patron-client relationship, which is not limited to the Middle East. It's not limited to any religion.
No.
In Greece, we have the same problem. In the Balkans, we have
clientelism as a sort of political form definitely intersects with these broader ideas of protection, as we were talking about. At least I think. And
and this is the reason why Godfather 1, Godfather 2, and Godfather 3 are very popular in this culture.
I think they're popular everywhere. I think they say a lot of very profound stuff about humans.
Yeah,
especially the first one.
Because
David Graeber's
very basic, fears and very basic reactions of human beings, whether they live in a more institutionalized society or in a tribal or semi-tribal societies, like in the Middle East or in the Balkans.
Well, David Graeber used to start his essays on debt with the scene from Godfather 1, the beginning scene where the guy comes to ask the Godfather for a favor to have revenge for an attack on his daughter. To explain the nation of indebtedness and favor asking, and
of course,
which I always thought was a great way of introducing the
funerary parlor came to him asking for a favor to avenge his daughter, who was beaten up by some punks. Thank you so much for your time. And
no, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it. It's been great to talk.
Of course, we can discuss these and other questions and other historical episodes in the future. Maybe one day I'm going to talk with you about your grandfather and the army of Craiova, who fought both communists and Nazis during the Second World War. Because
I look forward to it.
Very impressive historical episodes of a fratricide in Europe. Because many of these wars, particularly First World War and the Second World War, were total disaster, and lots of countries, even in 2021, didn't recover from such biological losses. First of all, some of them, of course, economically recovered, but biologically, they still didn't manage to overcome what they lost in first part of 20th century. I think no one won on the long run, and all of them lost. Thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes, thanks very much. Let's speak soon. Bye-bye.
All the best.